Commissioner Fritz is going to be here momentarily. We have a pretty high content process here for the next couple of hours, so I won't spend a lot of time in introductory remarks other than that, to state the obvious, we are in a housing emergency. And the Home for Everyone model that we have created, I believe, is the right model to address both homelessness and housing. And Mark Jolan is doing a great job of orchestrating that, and he's going to lead this work session. So with that, Mr. Jolan.
Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. I say us because there are a number of people who are going to join us over the course of the morning to share the work that they've been doing on this project. We do have, if you're looking at the PowerPoint, it's long, but we're going to move quickly through it. Just to set the context a little bit for you, this is a project that started more than a year ago. It's a combined effort of the City of Portland, Multnomah County, City of Gresham, Home Forward, and our philanthropic faith and business partners. And the purpose of the work broadly is to have one table, one place where we all gather to try to address the issue of homelessness in our community, to try to speak with one voice, to be very clear with the community what work it is that we're doing, what the challenges are that we face, and how we propose to tackle them. The beginning of this, and I don't know if Chair Kafoury has arrived yet, and so Chair Kafoury and Michael Bonacore, the director of Home Forward, are both going to join us here. Michael's here. Michael, do you want to come on up, Michael? All right. So I asked Chair Kafoury and Michael Bonacore just to come and talk about their experience of and the importance to them of this initiative and the collaboration that we have underway here. So, good morning.
Mayor, Commissioners, it's nice to be here. Thanks. Yes, so I'm here just to say a few brief words this morning about our ongoing commitment to the collaboration. We have been really heartened in the time that Home for Everyone has been in existence by the depth of collaboration and coordination, our sense of connection to the jurisdictions, and of doing our work in ways that feel connected to a larger system, and also appreciate the efforts that have been made, good morning, to inform that work by listening to the voices of the community. So my message this morning is simple. We are at the table and deeply committed. We continue to find ways to make resource allocation commitments and prioritizations that match the priorities of a Home for Everyone. We will, in the next couple of months, issue a new strategic plan in which our commitment to the partnership is explicitly called out. And we intend to continue to stay sleeves rolled up and deeply connected to this work.
Yes. Good morning, Madam Chair. Welcome. Just push the button. Because those of us, those of us who work in this building have been actually not using the system right, so they've been giving us remedial help.
Hello, is that right? Okay. I don't read instructions. That's not what I'm. Thank you, Deborah Kafoury, Multnomah County Chair. I'm sorry that we are in this close proximity because, as you can probably hear from my voice, I am a little under the weather. So I should have brought masks for everyone. Yes, scoot over. No, you deserve to be really close. Thank you for having us here this morning to talk a little bit about a Home for Everyone. As you know, ensuring that everyone in our community has a safe, decent, affordable place to sleep is one of our top priorities. We've learned through our work at Multnomah County that all of the other work that we do, be it alcohol and drug treatment, mental health treatment, nothing really seems to stick if people don't have a place to live. And that's why we formed Home for Everyone a little more than a year and a half ago, a partnership between the county, the city. I almost called you. Sorry, Home Forward. There you go. Still got the new name in my head. in the cities of Gresham and some of our other partners in the community. The way that we used to do things with the city working on homeless individuals and the county working with homeless families, we know that those artificial barriers just don't work. And having us work together as a team is so much more effective. We will eliminate barriers, we'll make things more efficient and effective. And although it's not very exciting to talk about, I like to say that, a mom whose kid is sleeping in a car doesn't really care which jurisdiction is providing the services. She just wants someone to help her. So last June, the county invested $2.5 million in new resources for housing placement and year-round shelter. And for the first time ever, we set aside $5 million for funding new affordable housing construction. The city matched our investment, and those dollars are now being put to work. A new shelter for veterans opened its doors on Veterans Day. Earlier this month, our former strip club was turned into a year-round family shelter and expanded its capacity to 150 people. And crucially, our family shelter operates on a no turn-away policy, so any family in our community that needs shelter can get it. These are the kinds of critical investments that we can make together, and I'm committed to working with you. We've, earlier this year, the county prioritized $10 million in our next budget, and the city thankfully has agreed for $20 million. And that $30 million investment, I believe, when put on the streets, will really make a difference for people in our community. Thank you.
Good to have you here. Mr. Saltzman, do you have any? So we really appreciate both of you as partners. I think this model is working well. And I think it's goodwill and good government combined. So thank you for being good partners.
And they forgot to put turn off mic when done speaking. So they're going to have to redo all of these instructions. Sorry.
So, Mark, I have a question. You have a long PowerPoint. At the end, when we have some questions about next steps, will we have representatives of Home Forward and the county here at the end of the presentation?
Not these representatives. So if you have questions for them, I would encourage you to ask them now.
Well, I just have a comment. Home Forward, traditionally in our community, houses the poorest of the poor. If you have no resources in public housing, you house them. If you are at 0 to 30 and you're the most impacted person in our community, you are a houser of first resort. The county provides services to people that are in need. We know that there's a whole segment of the people on the street that without services, their housing is not going to be successful. That's why we have a permanent supportive housing model of housing plus services. One of the things that I think is becoming clearer to us is that we've identified a crisis on the street, but there's a mismatch with the housing we're investing in. And when we hear that less than 15% of the dollars are going into housing that actually addresses the crisis on the street, that's a mismatch. That's not to say that people at 60% MFI or 80% MFI, workforce housing, people in that sweet spot don't deserve quality housing. We obviously do. It simply says that if you have $1 and you're in a crisis, do you put it into housing that's nice to have, or do you put it into the housing that the emergency is calling for? And I guess the question I'm going to have at the end of this, and the question I hope the council takes up each and every time funding comes before us, are we investing in the right housing? And if we're not, then it seems like we're going to have a problem, because whatever we're doing that you and the mayor are leading on an emergency basis is premised on the fact that we will get people off the streets into homes. Not shelters, but homes. And if we are not building enough homes that people in the streets can afford, then that's a mismatch. And so I want to put that out there, because I think in addition to all the great work you're doing, we're going to have to insist that the RFPs and the other things that we do target where the need is. And I would welcome your comment.
Thank you for that, Commissioner Fish. I am in complete agreement. I think two things. One is that the dollars that we allocated this year, the $2.5 million, a lot of that has gone to rapid rehousing, getting people off the streets and into permanent housing, as you talked about, not necessarily shelter. And in the past, we used to allocate $5,000 per family, and that was how much it took to get them into housing and then stable, and then we could move on. Now it's somewhere anywhere between, averaging about $8,500. So that's a big increase, which means that fewer people are able to get off the streets and into housing. And that's because the housing at the lower end of the scale is just not there. And as you talked about, I think it's crucial that we are targeting the dollars that we're spending on the construction side to the dollars and the numbers that we're looking for on the people side, because otherwise the two are not going to match. And if we're not building housing that is for the 0 to 30% MFI, we're not going to meet the goals that we've outlined in the presentation you're going to hear today.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, because no one here disagrees with the premise that we should provide housing for everyone. And when my daughter comes back from her great adventure and is priced out of the market, this will hit home. And we want workforce, we want entry-level workers, we want everybody to be able to afford a home. The problem is we have an emergency, and if there isn't a clear path for people on the streets to get into a stable home and begin to become sufficient, then that's a mismatch. And I just think that with all the bold actions being taken on the one side of the ledger and declaring an emergency, we're going to have to be rigorous in making sure the dollars are being spent to address that need. And I appreciate your comments.
Feel better.
Thank you very much. So in terms of the work session structure today, this was obviously an important way to kick it off, because I think the collaborative nature of this work really is what makes it stand out. We're going to do just a little bit of reminder about who's homeless and what some of the characteristics are of people who are experiencing homelessness in our community very briefly. Then share with you the model that we've been working from that helps us understand what the unmet need is and what it's going to take to meet it, both in terms of permanent housing and safety off the streets options. And then we're going to build towards sharing with you the recommendations for the $20 million in committed additional services that went to the executive committee about a month and a half ago by asking representatives from the work groups that did the community-based prioritization work around strategies related to housing, healthcare, employment, and safety off the streets to come forward and share what their work groups did, how they prioritized, and then have someone from our coordinating board also come and share with you her experience of the coordinating board prioritization process that led to those executive committee recommendations. So hopefully, by the time we're done here, you'll have a good understanding of the strategies that are at the core of the recommendations that are coming both to the city and to the county for how to invest the $20 million that the chair referenced. So that's kind of the plan. I've asked each of the speakers to make sure that their presentation is short enough that there's some time to ask questions of them. So hopefully that will happen. I think we'll try to stay ahead of schedule enough that we can ask questions at the end. We will also, after the coordinating board and Home for Everyone folks have finished speaking, Joe Zender will be here to talk about some shelter siting, regulatory reform possibilities, and then the director of the Housing Bureau, Kurt Krieger, will be here to talk about the development side of the conversation a little bit more in depth. All right. So starting with a reminder for all of you and hopefully for the community of how many people are homeless. Broadly, what we see in Oregon in the last count, about 13,226 people were homeless, and in Portland, 3,801. Just as a comparison, Washington had 19,419 people homeless, and Seattle had more than double the number of literally homeless people in their last street count. As you've heard, and we had the gathering of West Coast mayors here, the challenge of homelessness and housing affordability is not Portland's alone by any means. It's one that cities up and down the West Coast are facing at least as severely, and in some cases more severely even than we are. The best data that we have in our community to understand how many people are experiencing homelessness is our point in time count. It's something that we do every 2 years, but we'll start doing annually next year. The most recent survey was in January of 2015. And in that count, we identified 1,887 individuals who were sleeping outside or in a vehicle in a park, someplace not meant for human habitation. Those are unsheltered people. Then, if you include the number of people who are also in shelter and transitional housing, our number is 3,801. That is really the definition of homelessness that HUD uses. And so commonly when someone says how many people are homeless in your community, we say 3,801. But we also know that many, many people are doubled up and don't have permanent housing of their own, and they're surviving on somebody's couch or a basement. And the best estimate we have of that number, and this is on any given night in Multnomah County, 16,344 people. So that's inclusive of the HUD homeless number plus those who we estimate are also doubled up in our community. In terms of who is homeless, the street count also provides us good data, the best data we have on the demographics of the community. It is, as you can see here, I won't read all of the statistics, but we have over 1,161 women who are homeless. African Americans are dramatically overrepresented, as are communities of color in general in the homeless population. Veterans, as you've heard by now, in January of 2015 made up just 12% of the homeless population, about 422 individuals. Many of those veterans are now fortunately housed. Among women, 45% report having experienced domestic violence. We had 374 children under the age of 18 who were homeless on that night in January of 2015. There's a very high rate of disability in the community. 57% of the people we surveyed self-report being disabled. 36% of those self-report having a mental health disability. Almost half have an addiction disability. It's important.
But just to be clear, when you say almost half, do you mean almost half of the disabled or almost
Right.
half of the total population?
Almost half of those who identify as disabled identify
Okay.
as their disability as being an addiction. It's important to see that while it often feels like we have the same people living on our streets year after year, 33% of the people we surveyed had only been homeless less than 6 months. Only 27% of the homeless people we surveyed had been outside for more than 2 years. So we definitely do have a long-term homeless population, but many people in our community are becoming homeless, getting assistance, and going back into housing every year. So it is a population that turns over, and it's an experience that many more people have than just the 4,000 people who we count on a given night outside.
Mark, do we track where people are from?
We do ask where people are from. In the 2015 count, we had 80% of the people said that they had been in Multnomah County for more than 2 years. Only 224 people reported that they came to Multnomah County homeless. And of those, only about, and I'm anticipating the rest of this question because it comes up a lot, only about 15% reported that services were the reason that they came here. So we do have people, a small percentage, who are coming to Multnomah County homeless, mostly for the same reasons that anybody comes to Multnomah County, which is family, friends, a job opportunity, looking for a fresh start.
That 80% figure is very important because what we often hear, in fact, we've heard it since Bud Clark put homelessness as the center of the city's agenda, that by investing in a cure, we were putting out the welcome mat, which is an argument you hear at the federal level around every single program we invest in, and it's simply not true. And as you note, the small number of people that choose to come to Portland because it's Portland are no different than middle-class people who come here for a job or anyone else. Portland is a draw. But the overwhelming majority of the people we're serving are local people. And I think it's important people know that.
Yeah, I keep quoting the little statement that Carl Abbott did in the 1987 10-year plan, where he said that Seattle believes that Portland is sending them our homeless. Portland believes that Seattle is sending us their homeless, and Boise thinks that we're both sending them our homeless. So, it's just, it's a myth that will not go away.
True.
Any other questions before I move on about the population we have in our community that's experiencing homelessness?
Well, I guess I have one question, Mark. So in 10 years, 12,000 people go from the streets to homes. And yet, some in our community have declared that's a failure. How do you explain that distinction between the success that the community has had getting people off the streets and into shelter and homes, and the fact that homelessness continues to be persistent and stubborn?
As a perfect lead in to the next couple of slides. So why are people homeless? And I tried. Okay, it's going to build. So, in essence, it is the mismatch between income and housing affordability, right? The reason that we can, and last year, our community helped 3,500 people in 1 year move out of homelessness and back into permanent housing, and helped thousands more retain their housing who had housed in previous years. And still new people became homeless because in our community, many, many people are living on very little or no income. And as we've noted, we have a crisis of affordability, especially at the low end of the market. Our most recent estimates are that we're short 24,000 units of rental housing that's affordable to people who are in the 0 to 30% of area median income bracket. In that situation, a certain number of people are going to become homeless every year. And what we've seen over the past decade is that on average, folks, we were making some progress before the recession, but as the recession hit and housing prices continued to climb, but incomes fell, new people became homeless. What progress we had made, we were definitely set back. So that right now, what we've been able to do, notwithstanding the recession, is house about as many people every year as are becoming homeless, which is why in the last point in time count, we saw only about a 4% increase in the total HUD homeless population. So I'm pulling up here recession, unemployment, health problems. These are all related factors for why someone who is low income and paying too much for rent might become homeless. There are many people in those circumstances who don't. But at the end of the day, all right, I'm going to get there. Sorry. At the end of the day, it's really this chart that does as good a job as any of summarizing it, which just shows you in essence that even as rents have continued to grow fairly significantly, incomes have fallen, especially for our lowest income earners. With rents going up over 30% in the past 5 years, wages have fallen 5% at the same time. That is the recipe for homelessness in our community.
So Mark, I think this is an important point to dwell on. I mean, would you be able to estimate if rents and incomes had risen at the same level, or if, say, we could just say rents, let's put rents back at 2000 levels, what impact would that have on the homeless population? Would that cut it in half? Would it cut it in a third?
I definitely cannot answer that question with that specificity off the top of my head. It might be something we could go back and try to reconstruct, but I don't think there's any question given that a lot of what is driving this issue is inflow. Again, it's not a stagnant population of 4,000 people who are just out on our streets year after year. We're housing a lot of people. If we're not seeing a change in the point in time number, it means that just as many people or more are becoming homeless, and that really is for many folks just a function of not being able to afford their housing. I know we're hearing from our family shelter provider, Human Solutions, that somewhere in the neighborhood of 25% of the families they're seeing come into the shelter right now are reporting that they've never been homeless before. That's an indicator that the stress of low incomes, high rents is causing families to fall out in our community.
So do you have a number for the number of people who did not actually become homeless because we were able to give them rent assistance to do first and last to get them rapid rehousing? I think that's important too, because you shouldn't have to be out on the streets in order to be able to get the assistance. As we all know, it's cheaper to keep people in housing than to rehouse them.
I don't have the prevention number for last year, but I will get it for you. Mm-hmm.
Mark, this chart you've shown us with a gap between rent immediate changes in rent and income. I mean, that tells part of the story, but to what extent is it this gap, and to what extent is it that we have historically low vacancy rates and there just isn't a sufficient supply?
I think they're related. I think rents are increasing in part because there's so much demand for the limited housing stock we have. So the low vacancy rate creates challenges for people at a variety of levels, including that they may be more likely to be screened out. So folks who have barriers are going to have a harder time getting in when there are more people competing for the limited number of units that are out there. And at the same time, with low vacancy rates, rents rise because landlords can ask more for the units. So moving on to our plan, and when I say our plan, it is our community plan. It's a Home for Everyone, the United Community Plan to End Homelessness. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the framework for that plan so that you and those in the community can see what's driving the work that we're doing. And it really starts with a clear vision, shared values, and focus. The vision is straightforward, that no one should be homeless. Everyone needs a safe and stable place to call home. We have guiding values that we have all agreed to, that we must prioritize those who are most vulnerable, that we must promote racial and ethnic justice. We have to hold the programs we fund accountable and use data to make decisions. We need to engage and involve the community at every level, and we need to strengthen system capacity and increase our leveraging opportunities. And then we've got key focus areas in this work, and they are what anyone who does this work understands are the sort of essential elements of addressing homelessness. First among them, housing. Second, income and benefits, as we've been discussing. Third, health. Fourth, survival and emergency services. Fifth, access to services. And sixth, system coordination. All of the work that we're doing, all of the implementation and action planning work we do on this as part of this initiative is guided by this vision, these values, and these focus areas. Essential to this plan is that we're using proven strategies. We are asked often about whether we're using best practices, and Portland has been both using the best practices demonstrated in other communities and developing best practices locally for the better part of a decade. One of the strategies we've been using for a very long time in this community is now nationally recognized best practice of rapid rehousing. The vast majority of the people who leave homelessness with the assistance of our community partners are using rapid rehousing. It means a limited amount of rent assistance and some staff support to assist someone in finding a unit and getting set up in a unit.
Mark,
Yep.
and when you talk about using best practices, could you address the question, can't we just do what Utah does because they've ended homelessness?
I can briefly. So they haven't ended homelessness. To be clear, what they did is very similar to what we've done with veterans homelessness, which is they prioritized chronically homeless people in their community, and they were able to take the number of chronically homeless people that they were seeing in their point in time count on any given night, which was about 2,000 originally, down to a couple hundred a night. So they've built some capacity to house chronically homeless people by building a fair amount of permanent supportive housing and using a housing first strategy, which is also a strategy that we use. They started with a smaller number. They had a lot of opportunities around the housing development side that we don't have in terms of cost and state level engagement. So what they've accomplished is impressive and important to learn from. But the strategies that they're using are the ones that we also use in our community to try to meet the needs of chronically homeless people. And others may have more to add when they come up about that. So another important piece of the work is benefits access. This is helping people acquire income who are severely disabled and need benefits, long-term disability benefits, to pay the rent. Employment assistance, you'll hear more about these as we go forward. Eviction prevention, Commissioner Fritz, as you were saying, this is a critical element. We prefer to have people not lose their housing in the first place than have them become homeless and have to be rehoused. And then permanent supportive housing, which is the model of housing that Utah used and that we use as well to meet the needs of chronically homeless people. coupled with long-term rent assistance typically.
Mark, in terms of benefits, I had assumed that the passage of the Affordable Care Act and the Medicaid expansion would have a big impact on mental health and addiction treatment services, and that a lot of single people, who previously weren't eligible for those services would be under the ACA. Has that happened, and has that had any impact on your ability to help people with addiction and mental health issues?
So I think that has happened, and Amanda Saul is here from the healthcare work group, and she'll be up in just a few minutes, and maybe ask her that question. She can answer it better than I can. That's okay. So we're using best practices, and very importantly, this plan depends on accountable community governance. And so what you'll see here is just an organizational chart. The executive committee, by now, I think you're familiar with, that the mayor and Commissioner Saltzman sit on, and the chair and Commissioner Bailey. Michael Bonacor is there. Gresham is represented. That group has been meeting quarterly, will meet every other month to oversee the implementation of the work of the initiative. Supporting the executive committee is a coordinating board of appointed membership. It is really all of the stakeholder communities, very importantly, people with lived experience of homelessness, people in the nonprofit sector that are providing services, culturally specific providers. It's the business community, the faith community, representatives from education. So really, folks who engage this work at a variety of levels and bring the expertise to the table that make sure that the strategies we're pursuing are the right ones. And then they're supported by a series of standing work groups and committees, including what we call the Community Advisory Forum, which is a place where providers and service recipients come together monthly to talk about the experiences they're having. And we have standing work groups that you're about to hear from too, again, in the areas of housing, health, employment, and safety off the street, and the veterans group as well. All right, and now I'm going to ask Sally Erickson, had hoped to be able to be here. She couldn't today. She is the head of homeless programs at the Portland Housing Bureau. But Ryan Dibert, who works with her on her team, has agreed to come and do the next part of the presentation.
And I came to this end of the table to help co-pilot the PowerPoint a little bit earlier, so I'll stay here. I think it'll let me point out some of the pieces of the slides to folks who can actually see the electronic version, but I'll narrate them for you as well. So, as Mark said, one of the important things that we've done with A Home for Everyone is create that shared and accountable governance structure. Probably the most important thing from my vantage point that allowed is some real shared leadership, particularly through our executive committee, in challenging our community to do as much as we could. And I think in particular, one of the most innovative things that the executive committee asked at the very beginning of this work was they reached to our coordinating board and said, we want you to stop asking the question, how do we do the most we can with the limited resources we have? And instead, we want you to tell us, what would it take? That work of figuring out what it would take to actually end homelessness in our community and asking the question in that way was frankly a watershed in terms of how we approached assessing the scale of the problem and the potential solutions. So in doing that work, we had some careful modeling to answer that question, what would it take? And I want to step you briefly through what that looked like to set context for some of the plans, both that we've been implementing over this fiscal year and going into next fiscal year. So in terms of modeling what it would take, we have very good data about how many people are homeless in our community at a single point in time. From there, though, as Mark said, we know this isn't a static population of people. Many people move out of homelessness, so there's outflow. People are either move into permanent housing or they self-resolve. We'll sometimes say they're able to move out of homelessness on their own or through assistance that our providers help to provide. We also know, though, that many people come into homelessness. There's continued inflow into homelessness, either people becoming newly homeless or people who have been previously housed returning to homelessness. When we look at that picture over the course of a year, we can see that there's an annualized population of people who've experienced homelessness at some point during the year, and that there's a significant portion of those people who have a met need. They've been able to move into permanent housing from homelessness. There's also a significant portion that remain with unmet need at the end of the year. when the coordinating board, when the executive committee asked our board, tell us what it would take, specifically they asked, tell us what it would take to reduce that unmet need by half in the course of 2 years. So that's the modeling that we began to work using our current data. We started by asking, this next slide, the pre-HFE status quo slide. We started by asking if we just did nothing different than what we were currently doing, would that be enough? And to orient you to the slide, that dashed line there represents the 3,000 people per year that we were able to house in the 14-15 fiscal year, the level of effort that we were able to demonstrate. The red dashed line is that goal of decreasing unmet need by half. And we modeled, if we just kept doing what we were doing, housing 3,000 people per year, would it get us to that goal? And the answer there is obviously no. This is an important question, and it relates to your earlier question, Commissioner Fish, in terms of we have a great success story to tell, that every year we have been moving more than 3,000 people off of the streets and into housing. And yet you can walk outside the door today and see that there is still a persistent problem. This is a good picture and a very helpful way to understand why.
And I know it's not a perfect analogy, but I keep going back to a scene in my childhood favorite movie called Fantasia. And it's a scene in the basement of a house with a brigade of mops. And they're furiously mopping out the basement, but there's a flood of water coming down the stairs. And I liken it a little bit to how this community has responded to homelessness through the recession and now during a recovery, which has had some unintended consequences, which is people are valiantly in the basement trying to keep the flood from happening. But no one can prevent the flood. And the flood that is occurring is all the causes beyond our control. We don't send people to war. We didn't defund the mental health system nationally. We didn't, in and of ourselves, create income inequality. We're not, failing to enforce inclusionary zoning. I mean, we can go on and on and on. And the water that's coming down in that scene in Fantasia, we don't control. We've never said we did control it. But we're doing a hell of a job keeping the basement as dry as possible, which means getting people to a better place. And I think if we keep that in mind, we realize that ultimately there's a problem beyond our control, but the focus needs to be on supply. We have a shortage of units, and that is fundamentally the problem.
Thank you. So, we started by asking that question, if we just kept doing, would that be enough, doing what we were doing? And the answer was no. The next question we asked very quickly onto the next slide was, if we did what we were doing but just did it better. So if we improved retention from an already very high rate of 80% retaining their housing a year after their services ended, if we improved that to 85%, would that in and of itself be enough? And the answer, again, was no. So the next slide pointed us the way home, if you will, to look at additional placement. We needed to be able to move more people off of the streets and into housing than we had before. So what you see on this slide is a green line here that's showing our increased placement effort that would be required to move this orange line down, which is our unmet need line, to that goal of reducing unmet need by half. So we actually, part of what we were able to do in examining that was both look at the short-term goal and what it would take, but we were also able to, on this next slide that's titled long-term, additional placement only, we were able to start to map that out over the course of the next 10 years and ask the question, if we knew that we needed some increased effort for now to begin making headway, how much sustained effort would we need over time in order to keep up with that inflow and begin to actually reduce unmet need even more significantly? In this view, looking at additional placement effort only, what you see is that you would have to ramp up a system to one that could serve more than 4,000 people a year with permanent housing, and that we would have to sustain that indefinitely. And that really led us to a much clearer picture of ultimately what it would take, which is this next slide, which importantly adds this blue line to the mix, which is an increasing focus on homelessness prevention. So,
So just a quick question before you move on. Why did you pick reducing homelessness by half instead of completely eliminating it?
it was at the direction of the executive committee to look at what would be, I think, a very significant goal in a very short period of time.
And would it be fair to say that doubling the investments would end it, or is the second half much more difficult and expensive?
We can talk about that as we look to some of the out years. I think that the second half will require, again, an increased level of effort that wouldn't exactly translate to perfect doubling. Yeah. So just very quickly, again, this overall picture, the green line, points us to a fairly specific level of increased effort that we would need to make to drive down unmet need by half. And it points us to that very next slide that actually, it allowed us to start to model out specifically how much more placement would we have to do, how much additional prevention effort would we do, and roughly what would that cost. So in looking at this fiscal year that we're currently in, we said we looked and said we would need approximately $10 million more to house 750 people more than we had the year before. Between City Council and the Board of County Commissioners, that investment came through. We're delivering on that right now. And then in looking ahead to the coming fiscal year, that gap between our prior effort and the amount of effort that we would need in next fiscal year totaled about $30 million in increased investment and increased placement for about 1,350 additional people. As Mark covers a little bit later, some of those investment strategies, you'll see that they're very much geared toward meeting these goals.
Are you going to go into whether it's $30 million in ongoing or one time?
I don't think so quite in that frame. I mean, I think what this graph tells us is that however we fund it, we need to sustain it for a period of time, not indefinitely, but we'll need to make sure that we're able to continue that additional capacity in our system for a number of years.
So it's fair to think of the 30 million being ongoing for the next 5 years.
So with the caveat that of the $10 million is a capital investment, $20 million is the services, and that's really what's buying that, predominantly that increase in placement capacity. We obviously need the unit investments to continue at that level and higher. So yes, I mean, we're going to need to sustain that investment level, that $20 million of additional for several years.
And you don't foresee increases in the out years, at least under this plan?
So the way that the model works, no, I think we have to be aware that we have a significant number of chronically homeless people on our streets who are going to need higher level per person investments in order to successfully get off the streets. So to the extent that in the out years we've done less for them now than we needed to because we didn't have the housing stock available or the depth of support services, it could be more expensive to serve those people. It is possible, and we're certainly keeping our fingers crossed, that the federal government will come forward with more resources for the chronically homeless community. It's been in the president's budget the last 2 years. It is HUD's priority to address chronic homelessness, but absent that, we'd have to find the local resources to do it.
Mark, you've lost me on, you guys have lost me on this slide. So what is your baseline assumption here as to how much the city's going to invest annually from all sources to actually build housing? So this is some services and some placement, but are you assuming $60 to $100 million a year of investment in bricks and sticks over a period of time? Because without the inventory, many of our tools aren't working very well. Vouchers aren't working. Short-term rent assistance doesn't work very well if there's not available units. So the 30 million, particularly with a big chunk of that being services and short-term rent assistance stuff, I get that. But what's your assumption in terms of ongoing investment in bricks and sticks?
So the assumption around the 10 million and sort of what the work plans asked for was another 250 units a year specifically available to homeless people or people at risk of homelessness, so to very low income people. The $10 million is payment towards that by one means or another. And there's also a policy request in the work plan that we increase the overall commitment locally to 0 to 30 housing that came out of the work group and is separate from the specific financial ask around services.
So Dan and Charlie and colleagues, this is a lot of data, and it's sometimes hard to track it. And then, we have these council presentations on tax abatements, on projects, on everything. What I think we should consider is an impact statement with every project that comes to council that shows how the investment applies to whatever the goals are for the year in the different categories of housing that we need to invest in order to meet the plan. So whatever the Home for Everyone says we need to do at every level. I think what's missing is our ability to just check against that. Okay, we're spending this much money. It's a big chunk of our discretionary dollar. How is it going to address the categories that we've said we need to invest in to cut homelessness in half and make a dent? And that way it gives us each and every time we vote on this a reality check to see are we targeting the money to the right need, and how are we doing? So I think this idea of a housing impact statement makes sense. I want to talk to you both about it. It's done in other cities, and it is not very burdensome. But if we're saying that we've got to build 250 units a year for people that are 0 to 30, and we've got to increase our discretionary spending for services and placement, well, that's a plan. I applaud that plan. Now let's figure out how we meet it every time we do a budget decision or we do a funding decision.
So actually picking up, Commissioner, on your reference to $60 million a year, I mean, if we're spending something like $200,000 per unit and we need 250 units a year, doesn't that mean that we have to spend about $50 million a year on new capacity?
See, we're not spending anywhere near $200,000 a unit, and unfortunately, some of our critics have salted the narrative with that to discredit our work. And let me give you an example. Last week, Dan brought the St. Francis forward, and I think you noted, or Amanda noted, that our investment was fairly modest given the overall benefit of the project. That's because our dollars leverage other dollars. So we don't put anywhere near $200,000. And in fact, in Dan's most recent RFP, he put as a requirement that people show how they can bring costs down on the overall unit. But we can't allow those arguments to go unanswered because we don't put $200,000 of public money in. It may end up costing $200,000 because it's a special needs housing with all the bells and whistles and has common areas and healthcare clinic on site. Our piece is usually a fraction of that, and then tax credits and other sources fill the gap. But the public investment is not even close to that.
So do we have like an average for a new unit, here's how much public investment is necessary?
The problem with an average, I'm just going to caution you, and there's a lot of data, is that, and I want to just put it on the table, the kind of housing that we're lacking right now, housing plus services with spaces in the building to provide services, is by definition more expensive. So to get at the need, we're going to have to spend more in dollars and services, which is going to raise a question about not stretching the dollar as far as we could to meet other needs. But this is where the media does not do us a favor in just taking buildings, dividing by the units, and saying, look at that. They don't distinguish between who puts what money in. They aggregate things so that a building that's service enriched, that has all kinds of services built in, gets attributed to each unit to make it look like these units are exotic. And that's why averages don't work.
So housing, PHB's director, Kurt Krieger, will be here at the end and probably can answer that question as well.
So the very last slide I'd like to cover for this section is just, it actually helps to address some of the question that you offered, Commissioner Fritz, these questions about ongoing versus one-time investments. This takes those annualized numbers that we were looking at in prior graphs and switches it to look at on any given night in Portland. So it switches it back to that point in time view again. And just to orient you to the graph very quickly, the blue line is if we had stayed at the level of effort that we had previously had in terms of housing people, how many people would remain homeless on a given night. Again, it's that same picture of we're doing a great job of housing thousands of people, but on any given night, you don't see a very significant shift in the total numbers of people who are out. Versus if you make the types of investments in increased housing placements that are recommended through these plans, the green line begins to become the picture of how many people are homeless on any given night. The dashed line here is our current inventory of emergency shelter and transitional housing beds. So anytime the green line is above that dashed line, you have street homelessness. You have people who are living on the streets. There aren't enough available shelter or transitional housing beds on a given night. So the dashed line that's here is reflective of the increased shelter beds that we've been able to produce this year through the state of emergency, as well as the planned increases through next year through the plans that you're going to be seeing. I think importantly, it's also worth orienting toward this area that's in blue, which is really, that's that level of need that's intended to be addressed through the plans that you saw in last week's work session, a lot of the planning work that's happening out of the mayor's office in addressing the number of people who are homeless on a given night until we both begin to get more people off the streets and have additional shelter capacity that can address that need.
Just want to pause before you move on, because this is the number, $30 million to get to decreasing the level of homelessness rapidly. And I was not aware till this moment that, I mean, I've heard about the 30 million before, but I thought maybe there was another ask coming for 60 million later and then 100 million or whatever it might be. But let me just make sure I'm understanding. You're saying that if we invested, or if somebody invested 30 million ongoing, that would do it to get to half.
That's correct. And Mark is going to cover specifically some of the actual programmatic investments that we would need to make that happen.
Right. And how much of the 30 million is allocated to us versus the county? Has that been discussed?
So the commitment was that the county would contribute $10 million and that the city would contribute $20 million.
In this year's, the 6.2 that has already been allocated in the bump and other actions, that counts towards our 20 million?
Some of it, perhaps. I think it's what we need to see is a $20 million increase over what the base service level was coming into this year. So if some of that is sustained investment going forward, in other words, if it's an ongoing commitment, then it would count. The question is whether that resource is actually going to be spent in the next fiscal year or only in this fiscal year, in which case it wouldn't add.
Mark, I asked this.
For the baseline.
I asked this of the budget office commissioner, and what I was told is we have booked 10 million towards the 20. That's baked into our forecast. That is already, council's already made that decision. So the numbers we're getting of discretionary money in this budget are net of 10 million that's going to housing. That means we have a $10 million delta that we have to fill.
Okay, I don't know where you're getting that 10 from, because we put 5 in the bump, 1.2 from the so-called Airbnb money. Where's the other?
No, different. They put 10 into the forecast.
They put 10 into the forecast.
And we have to debate as a council whether any of those other, the council has to decide whether any other revenue decisions we've made count towards the balance of the 10 that we owe.
Okay,
That has not been decided.
so it might be a relatively small amount.
You might argue, and I might agree, that the Airbnb money counts towards the 10.
Well, it's new money. It's new money for
It's
housing.
new money. If you said $1 of TIF over here counts, I might push back because I'm not sure that's new. That's the new
Well, it's
money.
not ongoing either.
Yeah.
So this is really good news, and it's important that it's manageable. We have a number, and it's going to be really challenging to get to that number this year, and still $20 million with $10 million already budgeted for is something that is not, it's not unfeasible that we might be able to get there. And I think that's really good news. And yet we need, and that will take additional maybe cuts or revenue from the community, but that's the number that we need to get there.
Commissioner, I can't believe that I'm saying this to you, but isn't feasible with our current revenue forecast without making cuts to existing other services such as police, fire, and parks.
Right. but it's not $40 million ongoing. It's a number that may not be able to be achieved this year, in fact, without devastating cuts to police, fire, and parks. But it's not a number that we need another $30 million of ongoing money.
And the only other caution I would make is that it doesn't represent the total amount of capital that will be needed to generate to meet the unit need over time. I mean, that there's the $10 million will allow hopefully the buy down of affordability for a number of units, but I think closing that gap is going to require additional investment over time. Exactly how much I can't say.
Well, what you've baked in here is $30 million between us and the county, $20 million for their services, and 10 ongoing for construction. That's good.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, Ryan. So I'm going to move us quickly because we have folks here. So this was to give you a sense, the additional resources the chair mentioned that you put about $2.5 million of additional service money in. The county put about $2.5 million of additional service money. Just so you can see where that's going, it's meeting that year one number of additional placements that Ryan mentioned. We expanded the family shelter to year round. It's enough resource to place another 248 families. In part, we've got a commitment of 200 Section 8 vouchers from Home Forward. That's part of our ability to do that, which is fantastic. We'll move an additional 100 youth into permanent housing, as well as pregnant and parenting youth. And then there's an expansion of services to people with disabilities, income acquisition on the disability benefits side, the intensive street engagement team that you funded that will house some very disabled folks. And then for women, we year-rounded the women's shelter beds, and there's enough resource there to also expand the number of placements of women that we're able to do. A big chunk of the new resource went into the Veterans Initiative, 180 additional housing placements in this year. With those resources, as you know, we were able to house 695 veterans in the calendar year 2015 and reach our goal, actually exceed our goal. It also is funding additional shelter capacity. And then because this is a partnership with Gresham, there is a resource allocation to Gresham in East County for some specific work that they're doing. So that's 15-16, and I'm sorry I'm moving quickly. But now I want to come to the 2016-17 goals. And this is just what Ryan showed on the graph. In order to stay on target with our objective of meeting half the unmet need, we need to expand the number of placements by 1,350 individuals over what we were doing 2 years ago, so get to 4,350 placements. We need to start investing in additional prevention. That's that blue line. 1,000 additional preventions is what we're targeting. That will still leave a significant unmet need for safety off the streets, that light blue triangle that was on Ryan's graph. We think it's at least 650 additional safety off the streets beds options for people. So those have been the numeric targets, the goals that have driven the budgeting work that our work groups have been doing, that the coordinating board did. The executive committee gave us additional guidance to prioritize women, to eliminate the overrepresentation of people of color in the homeless population, and to serve people with severe mental illness. In order to get to those targets, we've been talking about the $30 million. This next graph is the pie chart of that. There is $10 million to go towards development, as we've said. We've been working with a budget allocation of $2.5 million to prevention, those 1,000 preventions, $5 million to fund the startup costs and operations for those 650 additional shelter beds, and then $12.5 million to accomplish the additional 1,350 permanent housing placements and retentions that are needed to stay on track. All right, so just to set the stage, with those numbers and that direction from the executive committee, we asked our work groups to convene. Again, we have a housing work group, a healthcare work group, an employment work group, and a safety off the streets work group. They met a couple of months ago and began looking at the original action plans that they had developed, the strategies, and said, okay, if we have this much resource to work with, what are our priority strategies? What do we recommend to the coordinating board and then to the executive committee be the investments that we make? So I want to invite up, actually, I realize I think Stacy is not, did Stacy make it? No, she wasn't sure she was going to be able to. So I will walk through the housing strategies briefly with you. This is a roster of all of the members. Again, this is a very community-driven process that we engage lots of folks coming from different sectors participating in these conversations. So the work group had several investment packages that they were choosing from. These were ideas that they generated that came out of our original action plans, reflected the practices that we know work well in our community currently, some that other communities are using. They did a ranking process within the work group, and this is what they came out with. And again, these were the subcommittee's recommendations. They suggested that we emphasize shared housing strategies, trying to capitalize on larger houses that might be out there, sort of an Oxford House style model that has proven very effective for different populations, for youth and for small families and for individuals. Then a significant overall increase in our placement and retention services. This is a combination of rapid rehousing dollars, staff that help people find units, move into units, and remain stable in units. An increase in investment in benefits acquisition, that's helping people get onto long-term disability. The cash benefit of that is in the $750 a month range. Emphasizing an investment in eviction prevention dollars. This is the reality that many of the people we're moving in with rapid rehousing dollars, something happens in the relatively short term, maybe 3 months, 4 months, 6 months out, we need to be there with rent assistance dollars to help them not lose the unit they worked so hard to get into. Tenant protection team, this was something that came up in the announcement of the state of emergency. We know that people are struggling to get into units sometimes because they're being discriminated against, their rights aren't being respected. A tenant protection team really is a team of lawyers and advocates who can work with people who are trying to get into housing to be successful in overcoming those barriers. And then once they're in housing, you'll see this shows up again on the prevention side, working with tenants to make sure that their rights are being respected, that they're not losing their housing unjustly. The contingency assistance pool, flexible funding. It is the thing that makes our efforts work at the local level. Our providers, when we ask them what is the most important tool we can give you, they will say, give us more flexible client assistance, more flexible rent assistance so that we can meet the emergent needs of the households that we're trying to serve. And then again, we have a huge and growing need in East County and in Gresham. It's one of the fastest rates of increase of street homelessness we saw in the street count was in East County and Gresham. This prioritizes resources to that community.
Mark, can I just make a comment?
Yes.
Priority number 2, placement and retention services. In Mark's prior life, when he was at Join, he helped move people from under Morrison Bridge into their first apartment. And one couple that he helped and Join helped was moved into a unit near Mount Scott Community Center in an apartment complex, which was suitable, acceptable, but it was not a place that anyone would confuse with first-tier housing. And they got a unit after being outside for 10 years, and that allowed them to begin to stabilize their life. That's beyond Mount Scott, so that's mid-county. And it was on a street that was not well lit with an industrial purpose on the other side of the street. And I will tell you that there was some funky stuff going on in the parking lot and in the area around it. So it was not the safest area. That building has been purchased by out-of-state investors as a real estate play because East Portland is now in play. And the first thing they did is they emptied out the tenants. And so I go back to Fantasia. This is another thing we can't control, but money is coming in here, and this was perfectly acceptable housing, first stop housing for someone who's homeless. And that apartment complex, purchased by out-of-state money, everyone evicted, and now being upgraded so they can get more rents. And the other thing I just want to mention about eviction prevention, it ought to just make our blood vessels pop that there are people out there that because they're $300 or $400 short on their rent get evicted. And then the parade of horribles follows, and we'll spend thousands dealing with the fallout and a lifetime of dealing with the trauma of the children. And we could have come in at a couple $100 a month to keep them in their apartment. And that's why historically we've prioritized upstream investments like that, because it's a few $100s to keep someone in their home. rather than thousands to deal with the fallout.
So that was the housing work group, and now I'm going to ask Andrew McGough from Work Systems to come up and talk to us a little bit about the work that the Employment Income Acquisition Group did. Thanks, Andrew.
Hi, morning.
Got to hit your button.
Morning, everybody. I'm Andrew McGough. I'm the Executive Director of Work Systems. We're the Workforce Development Board for Metropolitan Portland. I was also a member of the Coordinating Council and the co-chair, along with Rachel Post, who I see in the audience, of the Workforce and Economic Opportunity team. Rachel and I, as you can see, were joined by a broad array of organizations from across the community. And we also had some community members there who had experienced homelessness, and they were really invaluable in helping to inform the discussion and keeping us on track about what will and won't work. So we got together, and Commissioner Fish, I really appreciate your sort of focus on this notion of on the supply, and we've really got to figure that out. I mean, I totally agree with you. That said, we really kind of focused on the prevention and the retention side, trying to figure out ways, how do we help people acquire income and then advance in their wages to allow them to either avoid homelessness or stay in their homes. So one of our underlying strategies in all this, and I think it's a term we all use pretty loosely, but it really is about intentional alignment. What programs are out there, what services are out there, and how do we put them together to assure not only the best use of the resources, but to create the broad array of services that we know varied populations need to stabilize themselves and ultimately achieve economic self-sufficiency. So quickly kind of going through our recommendations, they, again, are a little bit unique in that they're mostly focused on prevention and retention. But the first one was about bringing workforce to housing. And the idea here was to build on what we think is a pretty successful model, and we call it the Economic Opportunity Program. It's a co-funded program by the city, Work Systems, and then a number of community-based organizations that really focus on connecting highly varied populations to career track employment and the other wraparound supports that they need really to advance in their careers, to acquire the skill training. And so what this would do is extend that model to homelessness and housing providers who are not currently engaged in it. So it would create some resources to help us bring in and widen the tent by bringing in additional organizations into that model. The second recommendation is about bringing housing to workforce. And that's really, again, it's kind of building on this economic opportunity program model. And it provides access to flexible housing supports, rental assistance, if you will, to individuals and households who are engaged in career track employment, but for whatever reason, they need that rental assistance in order to be successful in that training. Another story, Commissioner, is we often encounter people who are either living in their cars or in shelters, but they're attending colleges. So how do we help those folks to continue to be successful in college and acquire those skills that we know that will ultimately help them transition out of homelessness and into self-sufficiency? Our third recommendation is, again, building on this notion of aligning programs and focusing on populations that we know are most vulnerable. And this one is about housing and workforce alignment for TANF families. TANF is the primary public assistance programs, as I'm sure you all know. So this helps us to connect those DHS services, those DHS customers, again, with career track employment offered through the public workforce system, with housing resources and community-based supports. Again, trying to do that wraparound work that we know is so critical for people that have faced multiple barriers to employment. Our fourth recommendation, it's referred to as equitable access to employment, and as was mentioned earlier, people of color are disproportionately represented, majorly disproportionately represented in our homelessness population. And this really recognizes that and tries to work with those organizations who have specific expertise working with culturally specific populations and bringing them together with employer groups, so the PBA, and then also real employment opportunities offered through quasi-public organizations. We have some commitments by organizations like TriMet, like the Port of Portland, to create pathways to move people into jobs that are available in those organizations. And finally, we're looking to expand the Street Roots vendor program to East Multnomah County. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that model, and we know that it creates sort of an immediate path to income for people, while at the same time connecting those vendors with a variety of services that are offered either through Street Roots or through partner organizations engaged in that. So those are our recommendations, and appreciate any questions you may have.
Questions for Andrew? You nailed it. Thank you.
That was easy. Thanks a lot, all.
Really appreciate it. All right. Moving then to the work of our healthcare work group. Commissioner Novick, you asked about healthcare expansion. Lots of discussion about opportunities for alignment between health and housing. Manda Saul was one of the co-chairs of that work group and is here to share the work that they did.
Good morning, Mayor and Commissioners. Thank you for having me. My name is Amanda Saul, and I work for Enterprise Community Partners. We're a national nonprofit that invests in low-income housing tax credit projects and invests in the nonprofits that own and build these housing projects. I co-chaired the Health and Homelessness Work Group with Rachel Duke, Rachel Duke, formerly of Home Forward. So just really quickly to give you a little bit of background, our goal was to come up with some actionable recommendations for engaging healthcare providers and funders in Multnomah County to assess the crossover between people experiencing homelessness, to prioritize housing options for those folks, and to further identify health needs and strategies to increase engagement in healthcare. This is a lot about systems alignment work and is a little bit different for the traditional housing folks. And so our recommendations require a collaborative approach and really sort of working across systems in new ways. The work group include 25 experts, from coordinated care organizations, the Oregon Health Authority, the Medicaid insurers, Multnomah County, Oregon Housing and Community Services, hospitals, clinics, and housing and service providers. It was really all levels of the healthcare system involved in the working group, which is, I think, important because just like how our housing system is complicated, our healthcare system is equally as complicated, if not more. And so I think one of the things that we've realized is that we really do know what works. Portland has done a great job combining health and housing for many years through projects like Housing with Services run by Cedars-Sinai Park and other projects done by Central City Concern and Home Forward. There has been lots of research that has been done to show that housing people with chronic illness helps to reduce their Medicaid costs and improve their health outcomes. I think we all know this, and it's not surprising. Just to give you a little bit of idea of the scale, we tried to think about the scale in terms of how people experiencing a health crisis or having chronic health conditions, how that relates to our homeless population. And what we found was that a couple of years ago, the point in time homeless count, 53% of those people self-identified as having a disability. So we know that there's overlap between our healthcare system and our housing system. And then in addition to that, HealthShare, which is our largest coordinated care organization in the metro area, according to their data, they have 5,400 what they call high utilizers, or people that use a lot of Medicaid services. 5,400 in Health Shares region, which I believe is the 3-county metro area. You're welcome. And so our recommendations that our work group came up with are very similar to what the other work groups came up with. There's a theme, and I think some of that is because we are all working from what are best practices and what are evidence-based delivery systems. And we're all looking to upstream solutions, like your Fantasia example. So our recommendations ranked in order of priority. And then just really quick also to differentiate that, that our recommendations are really focusing on the services side, not the capital or construction side. So the housing work group focused on the capital and construction side, and we were really more focused on the services side. So our first recommendation is creating 100 new permanent supportive housing units, which is units sometimes known as Housing First, or housing units for extremely vulnerable people that need ongoing services and housing to be successful. And then staffing for housing stability and eviction prevention, which is a lot what Mark was talking about earlier. Another 50 units of permanent supportive housing associated with the new Unity Hospital, mental health hospital that's being completed in 2016. Discharge planning in the hospitals and the clinics to help folks who are exiting the hospital find at least temporary housing, if not permanent housing, which a lot of hospitals do currently, and the challenge, as we all know, is just not enough existing housing in our community that's affordable to folks. Specifically, also having a health and homeless project coordinator, so that staff person could either live in a hospital or in a clinic, but really help to connect homeless people and the health system a bit better. A tuberculosis registry, which came up at a meeting that I was not at. So I'm going to ask Mark to jump in on that one.
It's really an access to shelter issue, because shelters require someone to have a valid TB test. And right now there isn't a centralized way of knowing who has taken the test and should be accessing shelter. So it would facilitate that, make access for people much easier than it is currently, where they have to go and get their cards.
Thank you. And then lastly, training, development, and delivery for both the healthcare side and the housing side. I think through this work group, we all realize that we all have very similar struggles. We have similar challenges. If we can identify the gaps and the training needs, perhaps the two systems together can actually help reduce homelessness in ways where we already have strategies in place and funding. I think there's opportunities to work with the healthcare system more closely in ways where there's already funding that exists.
But can I just ask, my assumption was we passed the ACA, a whole bunch of people have access to healthcare they didn't before. You would hope a bunch of them become healthier. What has actually happened with people on the street? Have they not been signed up for the ACA? Have they been signed up but haven't found providers? They've been signed up and found providers, and as a result, we have a lot fewer people homeless because we have a lot fewer people that are dealing with mental health and addiction issues.
I can respond anecdotally, I suppose. We have been very successful in signing people up for healthcare. And I know from talking to people who work within the coordinated care organizations, one of their struggles is how to actually track down those homeless people and say, you have healthcare, we need to actually get you in to see your primary care provider, or use alternate ways to ensure that your health is handled in a preventative way. And so this coordinated care organizations are actually now starting to hire people, and we're looking at ways to, when people come into a clinic or come into a hospital, have as one of their questions is, are you homeless, or what is your housing situation? And sort of be able to identify those people a little bit better.
It would be nice at some point to have like a percentage estimate of here's what percentage of homeless people are not in the sign up for the ACA and should be. Here's what percentage are signed up but haven't actually accessed any care. And it also seems to me that this should be like part of the state agenda to be asking them to prioritize making sure that people who are eligible for care actually get it.
So let me, oh, so go ahead.
If you're outside, you may not necessarily be able to remember that your appointment is 10 o'clock on Tuesday or to get to it. So that is a piece I'm kind of concerned is not in your ranked priority strategies, because my understanding is that most people are in fact signed up, but that they're not able to get to providers either because they can't or because there aren't any providers.
So let me pose another issue and get your reaction to it in terms of how this new, more coordinated effort might respond. Might ask the county folks and the safety off the street folks to do the same, and that is, partly anecdotal information, partly not, partly statistical. The police bureau ends up being the mental health first responder. They're doing a better and better job averting suicides and otherwise addressing it. The Unity Center and housing coming out of the Unity Center seems to be a pretty coordinated, multi-jurisdictional, public-private response. Good so far. Similar issue, our police bureau are increasingly using Naxalone on the street to deal with people that are in heroin overdose. They are the first responders because often they're there even before our EMTs can get there. We appear to be in a significant wave of heroin addiction, driven by all kinds of factors. One is, of course, overprescription of opioids by the medical community, some of the same folks we're working with. And another, ironically, according to information from Colorado, might be that the legalization of marijuana has caused street dealers to cut the price of heroin. Oops, didn't see that one coming. So for whatever causal reasons, we've got a huge increase in the rate of heroin addiction. Some of those folks are homeless, some of them aren't. Increases a lot of the friction between the homeless issues and the community. If you look at the Unity Center example, where the police bureau's out there, cycling people through, picking people up in mental health crisis, taking them into a general purpose ER, having them discharged and rinse and repeat and do it all over again. We could do better than that. Now we're going to have the Unity Center. Now we're going to have hopefully housing coming out the back door of the Unity Center. Can you sketch, or now and later, can you sketch a similar model for how we might collectively get upstream in the heroin issue locally, even if it's just like mental health, if it's a national issue, it's here too, but we got smarter. It seems to me we've gotten smarter on the mental health side. How do we get smarter on the heroin addiction or on drug addiction as well between all of us?
This is way outside of my normal. But I think, addiction, whether it's any addiction, needs to be approached with services and with, similar to how we approach mental illness. We know that addiction services are covered by Medicaid. So if that person is on Medicaid, we know we have some ability to bill for those services. In Oregon, there's also, because of our state Medicaid waiver, we have something called flexible services or flexible benefits funding, which can really be used in a flexible way. So it could be used to pay for rental assistance. It could be used to pay for services. It could be used to pay for that coordination that's required to get those people, off the streets into a hospital and then get them housed. The CCOs and other folks are not accessing those benefits because they didn't come with any new money. And so how can we make policy changes, or how can we incentivize the CCOs and the big hospital systems to actually look at new ways to use these Medicaid sources?
Can I follow up on that for a second? Because we've been having this conversation for a long time. And we now know beyond any doubt that getting someone into stable housing saves a fortune in otherwise uncompensated, what used to be called uncompensated medical care, but now may be picked up through the Affordable Care Act. Let's use Leo Rhodes as a great example. Someone that we're all familiar with, street roots vendor, waited a very long time to get, from his point of view, to win the lottery, got a home forward unit, and his health has turned around, and he's no longer dealing with his health challenges on the street. He has a home, and he has a place to sleep, and he's made a lot of changes in his life that he's allowed to now that he has a home. So if we know that we can save a lot in unnecessary medical costs by housing someone, why can't we yesterday convince our friends at the hospitals and the CCOs to start allocating more money to help us meet the goals of the supportive housing? And again, Commissioner Novick had raised this at sort of a high level several years ago. Commissioner Fritz, RN, has raised this repeatedly. The council talks about it. And here we are in the middle of a crisis, and we're still talking about it. How do we make progress on this rather than just identify it as a no-brainer?
Well, so Enterprise just commissioned a study that's actually going to be out in the next couple weeks. We hired Providence's Center for Outreach, Education and Reform, something like that. I just bungled the acronym, but to actually look at the costs of the Medicaid costs associated with people living in stable, affordable housing, and then also to go a little bit deeper and look at what services helped to reduce Medicaid costs and increase health outcomes. And we looked at 3 different populations. We looked at people living in permanent supportive housing, people who are families, and people who are living in senior buildings specifically for seniors and people living with disabilities. And we're able to show, based on research, that just living in stable, affordable housing saves Medicaid $48 per member per month, which is not, that doesn't sound like a big number to us coming from housing development, but that, according to Medicaid people, actually makes a difference. We're able to further show that by providing services, that savings actually gets to $115 per member per month. And so I think the healthcare system has made some changes, but they are very research-based, very data-driven. They want to know that what they think of it as a prescription. They want to know that the prescription that they're giving, if it's for rental assistance or housing, is actually going to work.
So I think it's wonderful to identify the savings. It's like the vaunted peace dividend we've been waiting for out of the federal government. The problem is just identifying the savings without sharing the fruits of that effort doesn't get us anywhere. And if we said, just for instance, for every dollar we save, we'll take 50 cents to invest in permanent supportive housing, now that creates a long-term solution. Just reducing the inflow of Medicaid dollars is wonderful, I guess, overall in the system, but doesn't build the structural support. And I guess I'm still not clear why we haven't been able to just get whatever change in the law is necessary to allow the CCOs to be our full partner in investing in the housing that keeps people out of the emergency room.
I was going to say, I think some of those recommendations will come out with the report, which will hopefully help to move the conversation. I also think just having this work group where you're bringing the housing people and the healthcare system people together helps the conversation to move along. But I agree, it has been a long time coming.
Well, and I think part of the challenge is there's not enough money in the healthcare system. So getting upstream and the healthcare issues is their first priority, and then hopefully they'll get to housing. But first, we need to get more people into preventative care and have more providers.
And I was just going to say that I think this work group we're trying to create the forum for that, and the folks that are coming around the table can continue that conversation and look for the opportunities. So I'm mindful of the time. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you very much. So taken together the health, the housing, the health, and the employment work group recommendations, we haven't gone through it in detail, but get us to that 1,350 placements and the 1,000 retentions, and there's a lot of overlap. So when we took it as staff and sort of worked through the different investment strategies that groups had, there was a path we could see forward that turned into the increased placement and retention numbers that are our targets. But importantly, we had the 650 safety off the streets. I want to take a moment for that conversation because there's so much discussion right now in the community around shelter. The person who helped lead that group is Shannon Singleton, and she's here, so I'll ask her to come up and join us.
Good morning. Apparently, it's the day for sick people to come and talk to you guys, so bear with me. So I'm Shannon Singleton. I'm the executive director at Join, and I'm a member of the Home for Everyone Coordinating Board. Membership in this group, membership in this group was really broad and included folks from the business community, people sleeping outside, as well as providers. We utilized a modified consensus to get to some decision-making, primarily because, as you may be aware of, sometimes it looks like we're on really different ends of this spectrum when we look at what does safety off the streets mean. You'll see that we have a very minimum definition of safety off the streets with some things that are qualifiers that we expect to see. Those include that people are legally able to sleep there, that there's some sort of heat or warmth, that there's access to restroom facilities, that they are clean, and that there's folks there who are trained to provide at least some physical safety for people. The piece that we really highlighted in this group was the need to have service connection to these options. The Safety Off the Streets work group does not want to see shelters or other alternative sheltering options be put up without access to permanent housing placement. So we'd really like to see mobile services and linkage to permanent housing placement, access to rent assistance, and other types of operational support. That's why you'll see the top priority being strengthen existing safety off the streets options and expanding non-traditional safety off the streets options, followed by expanding facility-based shelter and then shelter diversion. I think one of the caveats that's important to remember about this work group in particular is our numbers are going to look a little odd. Some of our non-traditional options for safety off the streets mean that people would still count as homeless in the HUD definition, but we agreed as a group that this still provided some options for them to sleep safely so we could connect them to services. I'm always at the end because I'm real concise.
Thanks very much. Questions for, thank you. Get
So-
better. We need you out there.
So on this, I think Shannon mentioned it last week. George Devendorf, who's the director of Transition Projects, was here and talked about making sure that we had a dollar in permanent housing placement services for every dollar that we put into emergency shelter. We're actually hoping to be more aggressive than that. So we're talking about $5 million to run shelter capacity and $12.5 million to move people out of shelter and off the streets and into permanent housing, because it really is that critical. We would much prefer to create shelter capacity by moving people out of our existing beds and into permanent housing than by adding more beds. We have to do both, but we want to make sure we're maximizing the permanent housing placement.
Mark, is that where he got to the $12,000 per person figure? It's the combination of the short-term shelter plus the services to get someone housed?
I don't recall the $12,000 figure. He was saying $600,000 for a year of shelter, $600,000 he wanted to see per, and so I don't remember how he did the math exactly.
To 1.2 million.
As a combined cost for housing placement and shelter for 100
And then you
people.
divide it by the number of people we're
Right.
serving, and we get the, okay.
All right, thank you, Shannon. So this is the work group work. We're going to go quickly. The coordinating board wrestled with all of the recommendations. That was their job. And Alexandra Appleton is here. She is a coordinating board member, went through this process, and I asked her to just come and talk about the work that they did so that you can understand what went forward to the executive committee. Thank you for joining us, Alexandra.
Mayor and City Council members, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Alexandra Appleton, and I was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, and I'm an appointed member for the Home for Everyone Coordinating Board. as well as being a member of the coordinating board. I work at Mercy Corps Northwest Reentry Transition Center within the housing coordination team, and I'm a council member for the Women's West Domestic Violence Center, and I'm also a PSU student. Last year, a colleague sent me the application for the Home for Everyone, and I'm grateful because here I am. And as an appointed member of the board, my hopes are to offer my experience and insights about the problems that the homeless face, because these problems are directly related to the many other problems faced by homeless. We've talked about those things like jobs and adequate health care and recovery from addiction, and as well as racial and developmental discrimination. Over the past several months, I've brought my voice and perspective to the Home for Everyone's work in prioritizing the potential allocation of housing resources in a productive and efficient ways to benefit as many people as possible. As you've heard, it was essential to put the PIPs, the proposed investment priorities, in ranking order depending on issue status, projected outcome, and long-term need. While referring back to the collective recommendations, the data on racial disparities, and the particular expertise necessary to help people gain self-sufficiency. There was a wide range of ranking possibilities, and there was also consideration of combining the PIPs in order to achieve a better outcome, and there was also some PIPs that could be applied to more than one specific group. During the whole process, the Home for Everyone's objectives and goals were reiterated during the ranking, and a consistent reminder to all the members was not to focus necessarily on how much it was going to cost, but instead to focus on like what plans do we need to create to end homelessness. One of the things that I always remind myself is repairing the years and the generations of deprivation is not going to happen overnight and within a couple months of supported housing. And depending on the circumstances, stabilization may take years. For example, in my own case, my children and I have experienced such vulnerability, and as a survivor of homelessness, criminality, substance abuse, trafficking, and domestic violence, I know how difficult it is to raise a family and to address the barriers without a home. So I have a good understanding of what it takes to overcome such hardships and gain stability, and I express that through the way I prioritize by not sacrificing one for the other, and I think that's really important. On an end note, during this whole time and on a daily basis, I keep a few things in mind, which is the homeless and the vulnerable populations are the most resourceful and resilient communities. And in my experience, both personally and at my job, there is a strong desire for ourselves and for our families to be independent and break the cycle of poverty. To our credit, even under the worst circumstances, when we do gain stability, we help the next suffering person achieve their independence. So this has to be a communal effort, and I am certain that the prioritizing work that the Home for Everyone contributes to its initiative to end homeless has been on point. I'm pretty good at that. I'm pretty sure of that. This is a good start, and of course there's so much more work to be done. Specifically, the time has come for us to start allocating the resources and put plans into action. And I just want to thank you again for letting me speak.
Thank you. Thanks for your help with this. Just maybe get you to answer one question from your perspective, and that is, we as elected officials and the folks in this room that are doing the work are dealing a lot of the time with people in the community that don't understand, don't have the lived experience. And I think you probably understand this particularly because of your work at Mercy Corps, but we seem to be experiencing some compassion fatigue, that people just want it to go away. What would you say to those folks?
I would say be patient. It's not going to go away unless we do something about it. I know it's hard to put, it's kind of like one of those things, a lot of people think of it like if the shoe fits, wear it. But it's not necessarily like that, because sometimes you need to just buy a whole different shoe. And all I can say is that I just keep reminding myself is that what's lacking is that a lot of people forget what we have to bring to the table. Although we're homeless and we have all these issues and we have a lot of barriers and we just have so much to overcome. If we're given a chance and we can utilize it, then the community becomes better overall. And I think a lot of people forget about how much we can bring to the table. All we do is forget about what, think just push them under the table. But if we give people a chance, not only will they gain stability, but they also want to be part of the community and they can help in the process of building a better future. So, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Alexandra. All right. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what we've gone through to land on some very specific recommendations. And I'm going to race through them because we don't have time, and I want to make sure we don't lose the opportunity to hear from Joe and Kurt. But in essence, to achieve the 1,350 placements, you'll see it's a combination of about 1,160 rapid rehousing placements and about 190 additional permanent supportive housing placements using a mix of the prioritized strategies that the work group came up with. There is an emphasis on eliminating the overrepresentation of people of color in the community. We think we can do that. We can house 1,000 additional women with this resource, some in rapid rehousing, some in permanent supportive housing. And in this resource allocation, we can house at least an additional 57 people with severe and persistent mental illness in addition to the 190 chronically homeless people. Then going to the prevention side, again, we're going to achieve this 1,000 additional preventions and diversions through a mix of strategies. About 550 preventions, meaning someone currently has permanent housing, they're going to lose it if we don't intervene. Diversion is where someone may not have permanent housing right now, but they're doubled up or they're coming out of a hospital or out of a jail, and they're going to wind up in the shelters or on our streets if we can't help them identify permanent housing. So a number of strategies serving people with disabilities in the housing they currently have or coming out of the hospitals. And here again, you see some general investment in tenant protection team and transportation assistance, things that we know can help keep people from becoming homeless or from coming into the shelters or onto the streets. And then finally, coming to safety off the streets, here you see again a heavy emphasis on sheltering women in both facility-based and alternative strategies. The sum total is about 410 additional traditional facility-based shelter beds and 265 alternative options for safety off the street.
What do you mean by alternative?
So our traditional purpose-built shelter, like the ones, the Bud Clark Commons or the Clark Center, is sort of one version. It has a certain cost structure and service package around it. We have alternatives like everything from Right to Dream to church-based shelters to something like Sears, where we're in there on a temporary basis, that can be more cost-effective in terms of a per person per dollar invested, may better leverage the resources that the homeless community brings to the table themselves. So it's opening that door up to recognizing that we don't have the resource right now to put everyone in traditional facility-based shelter, that we can create safety options, and so long as we're connecting people to permanent housing options out of whatever those safety options are, we're meeting that need in our community.
Mark, I know we're running short on time. Can Kurt join us for a second? Since one of the questions I think we'll have is the interplay between these recommendations and the budget process.
Yeah, so I am, I think, pretty much finished. This is again your the graph we started with, what we're trying to achieve, and those are your coordinating board members.
Maybe it would be good if Joe came up.
Yeah, Joe, would you like to come up too if you're here? Joe's under. So the remaining two conversations are on the development side and then the shelter siting. And I appreciate you both joining us today.
Good morning. Housing Bureau Director Kurt Krieger, and happy to answer questions, but I'll defer to Joe to introduce himself first.
Joe Zender, Chief Planner, Bureau Planning and Sustainability.
And I have a few presentation slides to make available to you. It's cached at the bottom of the toolbar there. I think everybody has one. You get one. You even get one. Absolutely. The other thing I'd like to do is Metro on February 1 issued a Equitable Housing Report, and they actually captured and humanized the spectrum of housing need by looking at people with 0 to 30% of AMI up to market rate. And this is very helpful because people, we get very clinical and we talk about people and people's incomes, but we're basically talking about minimum wage workers and people on Social Security and Social Security disability. That doesn't mean that they don't have potential for greater earning, and oftentimes they do, but that portion of the housing spectrum doesn't exist by itself. It interfaces with people between 30 and 60% of AMI and up to market rate. And when we housers talk about housing needs, we talk usually about different elements of the spectrum, so I want to make sure that you're at least aware of the role that 0 to 30 plays in that regard. And let me call up the slides here real quick.
Yeah, is there? Yeah, go ahead and.
Complicated than our homeless and housing system is our PA.
Well, Mayor, I have to say, I just have to, there's a great irony here. We now have instructions. We have instructions for how to use the microphones. We've gone through this entire proceeding with the microphones working, and yet you and I both have microphones that say "do not use." So I just
That was confusing.
I'm
It's
feeling
actually those three buttons tonight.
I'm feeling whipsawed here. I don't know which instruction.
The home audience can now see what I'm talking about with respect to these slides. So I won't dwell on the spectrum, but I'll leave it as a leave behind piece, and we can talk about it a little bit later if we have time. My real purpose today was to talk specifically about the 0 to 30% portion of the Housing Bureau's portfolio. And I actually started diving into this several months ago. And what I felt was important to call to your attention is that this exists with other resources at play. For example, we have about 13,200 units in the entire PHB portfolio. Of those, by design, about 2,112 are structured to be affordable to people between 0 and 30% of median income. Of those, about 1,000 have project-based rental assistance vouchers, and others are supported financially. So that's about 16% of the total. But then I started asking the question about what of the 6,000 Home Forward vouchers are in housing units that we own? Because when you have a voucher, as Commissioner Fish has mentioned, people are essentially guaranteed not to pay more than 30% of their income for utilities and rent. And we have nonprofit partners and other partners who have an open door for folks with vouchers. So we looked specifically, and I want to laud Home Forward for making this data available, but we did a data scrape of all of their units, and these are tenant-based vouchers where people are voluntarily choosing to use that. And we found that of the 6,000 vouchers, about 1,025 of them are actually used in PHB properties. So that basically elevates the 0 to 30 portfolio to about 24% of the total. We then wanted to look at the short-term rental assistance because you have, through direct investments, provided 18 months to help bridge people into longer-term settings. The idea being that they're on a waiting list for permanent housing, public housing, perhaps a voucher, a permanent voucher of their own. And we have 1,550 of those households that receive assistance from the city. And indeed, many of those folks, 400, are in properties that are assisted by the Portland Housing Bureau. So of the total units that we own and manage, 13,197, about 27% are for 0 to 30 households, both by design and then by happenstance. People are using both short-term rental assistance and vouchers in those units. So I think it's meant to show that it's a resilient stock, and obviously, as more short-term rental assistance is made available, that stock can serve that population. I might add that of the 6,000 vouchers, of course, nearly 4,800 or so are in the private market. And those are important assets. I think it's laudable that private landlords make those units available, but they're not obligated to make them available. And as the market has gotten more and more robust, more and more landlords have decided to opt out of the program. We've taken some steps to help mitigate that. The utilization rate, as you will recall, in the fall budget modification process by Home Forward was some 75%. You allocated about $445,000 to help improve voucher utilization. Some of that went to pay for Washington State University to do a rent comparability study, and HUD about 7 days ago increased the fair market rents for the Portland metro area by 33%. The other $400,000 is made available to cover arrears that tenants might have, unpaid utility bills that are barriers for them to receive a placement with a new housing unit. Even though they might have a voucher, they might not be able to use it until those arrears are settled. And we are matching funds with Home Forward to pay for 3 culturally competent navigators so that households that have language or cultural differences with the property owners can help navigate the process a little bit more easily. So those things working together, I think, will help us maximize the potential. And I realize that there's a great deal of interest in serving the poorest of the poor, and the previous dialogue was very clear in that regard. I do want to understand.
Let's just be clear. A full-time minimum wage worker in our community is eligible for a 0 to 30.
That's correct.
So when we say poorest of the poor, yes, people on Social Security, people that are formerly homeless have no income, but a full-time minimum wage worker, a cashier is just above the line. So we talk about poorest of the poor, we're talking about people that are hardworking, playing by the rules in entry-level jobs that have no chance to find affordable housing. They're not
Indeed.
just the formerly homeless and others.
Yeah.
And there's 24,000 people in that category.
Indeed. And I think it's worth repeating, and that's why I wanted to humanize this a little bit so that we get above and beyond the numbers. There are some reasons why we undertake mixed income developments, and I think it's important to underscore that. One is financial sustainability of the property itself. Extremely low incomes don't pay enough rent to cover rent, utilities, the cost of maintaining and operating the property. So the Home Forward vouchers are helpful because that's an offset. The landlords receive a cash offset to their operating costs. So financial sustainability of the portfolio is quite important. The second is we undertake projects in new areas. We try to gain neighborhood acceptance. And having a mixed income approach where you're infusing extremely low income people within a larger property actually helps us attain that acceptance. If we were trying to locate projects that were 100% extremely low income, we would have fewer options with neighbors to do so. And a corollary to that is by including extremely low income people in a larger mixed income setting, they are not isolated or segregated. They have opportunities, they have a lot of contact with other people. And then finally, much of our planning goals has to do with retail viability of multifamily properties, especially as we looked at the 2035 comp plan. So market feasibility of commercial aspects of mixed-use developments are greatly enhanced with a mixed-use approach, a mixed-income approach. So we agree that it's important to have a strong emphasis on the 0 to 30, but we want to make sure that you always take into account the tempering aspects of why you want to do a mixed-income portfolio.
You know, in terms of your handout, is it a good thing, a bad thing, or a wash that Home Forward Section 8 vouchers are being paired up with our stock? So in effect, 2 subsidies are being tied up for 1 unit. Is in a perfect world, wouldn't the Section 8 voucher be purely in a private market unit, and then we would be directing our subsidies to our regulated units to get a bigger bang for the buck?
Well, the only ones that are specifically tied are the project-based rental assistance vouchers. And in the current NOFA, we have 100 or so available out of the entire offering. So I think in a perfect world, you would be buying down private-owned units, and you would basically lever into the stock of affordable housing units, units that would otherwise be lost. I must say that in some respects, because of the high quality of the properties that the PHB is managing and our nonprofit partners' commitment and the physical location of these properties, they're very attractive to folks, that they can choose to live in a high opportunity area in a property owned by a CDC, which is affordable to them. And they have shopping ability. They can take this voucher to Sacramento if they want to, right? So it's obviously highly attractive for them to use those vouchers in permanently affordable stock. The other thing I would say is that if you are in a privately owned voucher unit, the landlord can opt out of the program. So you don't necessarily have certainty or long-term assurances.
So I just want to make sure I understand the future here. So we're trying to address this gap, and if there's 24,000 people that are priced out, and we have still less than a third of our inventory targeted to 0 to 30. We have a lot of work to do going forward. The inclusionary zoning debate in Salem has now inexplicably shifted to 80%. According to this chart, that means we're focused on police officers, high school teachers, very worthy. We want to keep them in the city. Has nothing to do with the people on the street that we've declared an emergency around. So there's a complete mismatch. We had an RFP that came to council recently with 5% of the units set aside for 0 to 30. It's going to take an awful long time for us to build the inventory. So what's the mechanism for us to over the next 10 years close this gap systematically? And what do you want us to do at budget time to help you? Because I know you're deeply committed to it, and so is the Bureau. But what do you need us to do as a budget committee to help you move the ball?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because we're in the midst of budget, and the CBO is as recently as 10:30 this morning is giving us specific direction about sort of the budget. I think it's important to note that our fiscal 2016-17 budget does respond to the Home for Everyone Executive Committee's request. It does place into, at least proposes 50% of the necessary funding. As Mark explained, the current split of the increased funds was really a 2/3, 1/3 split. We think that, at least insofar as we developed our budget, we felt like a 50-50 split was worthy. I think that's a debate that we'll have to play out at council, and we'll respond to questions when they come.
50-50%.
The 50-50 split being a 50% county, 50% city split. We haven't seen the county's budget yet, so I provided them with my budget, but we haven't seen their budget yet. So I think that will be an important starting point. The other thing that I'd like to mention is that the CBO has asked us for about 8 packages as it relates to our modified base budget. About $3 million of that goes into various shelter activities. The intense street engagement, the women's winter shelter, and veterans rental assistance are all priorities that CBO is asking us for greater detail on. But I would underscore the fact that we're not just serving the homeless, we're trying to provide rent stabilization and rental rehabilitation stability in East Portland. So several of the DP packages relate to rental rehab in East Portland and homeownership assistance in East Portland, because we can't ignore the realities of gentrification in some of these rapidly changing neighborhoods. The other thing that I think it's my job to do is to put as many new tools into play as possible in advance of a voter-approved bond measure, so that people can't use the excuse that we're not using all the tools at our disposal as a reason to vote no. So the 2017 budget does contain some $14 million in revenue created by the securitization of the transient lodging tax into a bond. That is fungible, not necessarily tied to projects that we own, unlike a general fund backed bond would be. So that gives you some flexibility.
And it can be used outside of ERAs, which is a terribly important point to make because most of our funds are tied to the 8 open ERAs. And we will be actively working to help improve the state policy as it relates to inclusionary housing. I'm not willing to give up just yet. We still have another week or so.
Going down this afternoon, I don't want to waste the trip.
Absolutely. What we've made it clear is that the any financial assistance the city of Portland puts into housing won't be for populations above 80% of AMI. We simply have too deep an unmet need under 80% of AMI to be making those kinds of commitments. And legally, most of the sources can't be used for that population. We can do things like density incentives and FAR bonuses, which Joe can speak to in great detail, but there won't be a lot of financial offsets for that population. So
Well, thank you, and it won't even take 5 minutes. We're going to, over the next 6 months, we're bringing forward to you all a package of code changes looking at ongoing the location requirements for emergency shelters, for mass shelters. In the zoning code, we regulate how big the shelters could be by zone. We regulate what kind of review process it needs and how close they can be together. We're proposing, and we'll bring this through the PSC and City Council, to increase the total number of beds that can be in an emergency shelter, and it varies by zone. Roughly, we're increasing them in some zones by 50%. In the smallest shelters, we're doubling them to 50. They never exceed 50. Secondly, we want to lower it from 50 people. Yeah, beds, sorry. We want to change it from a type 3 review to a type 2, and that technically what that does is cost half as much and takes half as long, but uses the same criteria and has similar opportunities for public appeal if there's an issue. So we think that it can cover community concerns adequately that way. Finally, we're taking a look at how far apart these shelters can be. Currently, they're limited to 1,300 feet, a quarter mile. It's like 5 blocks. We're going to explore the opportunity to cut that in half. At one time, our regulation was only 750 feet, so this was something that we increased in the 90s. These aren't big changes, but they actually help with the bigger shelters, especially in bringing these shelters to scale, the greater scale that they can get in number of beds seems to help their efficiency and the ability to deliver services.
Will these changes be part of they're not part of the comp plan, it's part of our code doctrine, a recap is the acronym?
Well, actually, in everything but the distance between shelters, we're comfortable making recap, so it's not even a big deal, and we think that people are going to want to talk about the distance if we decide to do that one. So we'll just bring them together in that time frame, they'll recap.
All right. So,
Mark, will you be at the table when the housing budget comes forward to make sure that we're synced up with the recommendations of the Home for Everyone?
so I doubt I'll actually be at the table, but I'm certainly working very closely with the Housing Bureau on
Well, Mayor,
all of this.
Yeah, he'll be available.
I'll be available
As
for
long as
sure.
you're there as a resource. I think a number of us are going to have questions about, does the budget fund the priorities of the Home for Everyone? And if there's a deviation, how do we address it?
So I'm glad to be there as a resource, and that is sort of my last comment is that the recommendations that came to the executive committee, parallel budget requests have been made on the PHB side and are being made on the county side, again, in alignment with the idea that this is a collaborative effort. We're doing this together as one community with all of our partners at the table, and that if we can make the kind of commitment of resource that we're talking about, and very importantly, support our providers out there that are being asked to do this work, I think we can have a tremendous amount of success tackling this crisis. For lack of a better word, it is a crisis out there, and I appreciate all the support that you all have given to this effort.
Well, thank you for a very clear plan. Thank you, Commissioner Salzman and Mayor, for working on this. One question that I'm going to want in the budget process is whether we should use the 1.2 million in additional ongoing to fund construction, which then takes it out of the ledger for the ongoing rent assistance and other essential services. It's hard to get ongoing money, so that's something that I'm going to want your advice on as to which is the higher priority.
Mayor and Dan, thank you for bringing this forward, and Mark and team, thank you for a superb presentation.
Good work, everybody. Thank you very much.